This is all the formulas that you need to know for 9702 AS Physics. Let's start with circular motion. Omega is angular displacement over time. This can be simplified to 2 pi over time period. Second formula is velocity equals r omega. Acceleration is r omega square. And I know that omega can be written as v over r. So instead of omega, I'll write a equals r. Instead of omega, I write v over r whole square. So when I whole square this, v gets a square, r gets a square, r and r gets cancelled, and I get a equals to v square over r. Circular force is mr omega square. This can also be written as mv square over r. Next chapter is gravitational fields. Gravitational force is gmm over r square, where g is the gravitational constant, capital M is the mass of the planet, small m is the mass of the satellite or the orbiting object, and r is the radius. Gravitational field strength is gravitational force over m, and I know gravitational force is gmm over r square. Divide this by m, this m gets cancelled, and I get gm over r square. Gravitational potential energy is negative gmm over r. Kinetic energy is half times mv square, which can also be written as gmm over 2r. Gravitational potential is equal to the gravitational potential energy over m. I know that gravitational potential energy is negative gmm over r. Divide this by m, these two small m's get cancelled, and I'm left with negative gm over r. The orbiting volt velocity is under root of gm over r. And finally, you need to know the relationship that t square is directly proportional to the radius, the cube root of radius. So I can write t square equals to 4 pi square r cube over gm, where t is the time period, r is the radius, g is a constant, and capital M is the mass of the planet. Moving on to electric fields. Electric force is charge into electric field, and electric force as a to q over r square, where k is a constant, capital Q and small q are point charges, and r square is the distance between those charges. Now I know that F is equals to EQ, so if I move q down, then I can write E equals to F over q, and I know F is kqq over r square, so I write kqq over r square over k. This k and this k gets cancelled, and I get kq over r square. Electric field is electric potential over the distance between the electric field. Voltage is work done per unit charge. Voltage can also be said to be electric potential, and electric potential is kq over r. Velocity v equals to under root of 2 vq over m, where this v is the voltage. Moving on to capacitance, q equals to where q is the charge, c is the capacitance, and v is the voltage. Energy equals to half into cv square. Similarly, energy is half into qv, because I know c is q over v, so I can write E equals to half into q over v into v square. This square and v gets cancelled, and I'm left with half equals to qv. E equals to q square over 2c, because v equals to q over c. So instead of E equals to half cv square, I replace v with q over c. So E equals to half into c q over c, square these because this has a square, and this c and this square gets cancelled, and what I get is E equals to q square over 2c. Time period t equals to rc, where r is the resistance, c is the capacitance. Voltage is v naught is the initial voltage, v is the final voltage, into e raised to power negative t over rc, where t is the time taken. Similarly, I is I naught e raised to power negative t over rc. And finally, q equals to q naught e raised to power negative t over rc. Now comes thermal physics. Temperature in Kelvin is equals to temperature in Celsius plus 273. Q equals to mc delta T, where Q is the energy, m is the mass, c is specific heat capacity, and delta T is the change in temperature. Q equals to ml, where L is specific latent heat of fusion. Q equals to mlv, where LV is the latent heat of vaporization. Now comes the famous formula PV equals to nRT, where P is pressure, V is volume, N is number of moles, R is a constant 8.31, T is temperature, and this temperature must be in Kelvin. Now I can replace this N and R and write PV equals to nKT, where N is the number of molecules now, and K is a constant. T is still temperature. Temperature in Celsius equals to RT minus R0 over R100 minus R0 into 100 degrees. Now what are these R's? First of all, RT is the distance on the temperature scale at temperature T. And R0 is the distance when the Celsius is at 0 degrees. R100 is the distance when the temperature is at 100 degrees. Now PV equals to 1 by 3 nm into mean square speed. Moving on to radioactivity, E equals to mc square, where m is the mass defect and c is the speed of light, and E is the binding energy. Binding energy per nucleon equals to the binding energy over the number of nucleons. Activity equals to negative decay constant into number of molecules. Number of molecules equals to n naught, where n naught is the initial number of molecules into e raised to power negative decay constant into the time. Similarly, activity equals to initial activity into e raised to power negative decay constant into the time taken. Now, half-life equals to ln2 over decay constant. And finally, decay constant is the change in number of molecules over the final number of molecules into the change in total time. Moving on to two big chapters, magnetism and electromagnetism. First of all, the reaction you learned in AS, which is I equals to NAQV, where N is the number of charge carriers, A is the area, Q is the charge, V is the velocity, drift velocity to be specific. Magnetic force is equals to BIL sine theta. And if you have charge given instead of length, then you use QVB sine theta, where B is the magnetic flux density, R is the current, and L is the length. Q is charge, V is velocity, B is magnetic flux density. Moving on, magnetic flux density can also be given as U naught into N into I, where U naught is a constant, N is number of molecules, I is current. Magnetic flux density can also be written as the force over current into L sine theta. Radius R is equals to mv over bq. Moving on, Hall voltage VH is Bi over NTQ, where N is the number of charge carriers, T is the thickness. Magnetic flux equals to BA sine theta, where B is magnetic flux density and A is the area. Magnetic flux linkage, or simply N into magnetic flux, is equals to NBA sine theta. EMF induced equals to change in magnetic flux over change in time. VRMS and IRMS both equals to the initial voltage over under root 2, or in the case of current, the initial current under root 2. Moving on to quantum physics, energy of incident photon equals to Planck's constant into the frequency. Work function is equals to Planck's constant into the threshold frequency, or the minimum frequency needed to emit an electron. De Broglie's wavelength equals to Planck's constant into momentum. Momentum equals to under root of 2m VQ, where this V is the voltage. VQ can also be written as E, energy or work done. De Broglie's wavelength equals to Planck's constant over under root of 2m VQ. because momentum is under root 2 mvq and de Broglie's wavelength is h over momentum. The photoelectric equation, total energy E equals to the work function plus kinetic energy maximum. This can also be written as HF equals to work function plus half times mv square. So now moving on to simple harmonic motion. Simple harmonic motion has this main formula, which is acceleration is directly proportional to omega square and inversely proportional to the displacement, where x is the distance traveled by the ball. This is a really important formula, and you can also write this when they ask you for the definition of simple harmonic motion. Then comes omega is 2 pi over t, or speed is distance over time, where this distance is the distance traveled by one complete circle or the circumference of the circle. V max or maximum velocity is the amplitude times omega. Another really important formula, velocity is equals to plus minus omega into the under root of a square minus x square, where x is the displacement and a is the amplitude. This plus minus refers to the ball moving for left and then going towards the right. Maximum acceleration equals to negative a omega, similar to velocity with a minus sign and a square on the omega. Maximum kinetic energy, total energy, and potential energy all have the same formula, which is half into the mass into omega square into the amplitude squared. But potential energy, instead of writing the amplitude, you write displacement. Time period in series is under root 2 into the time period. This means that as the spring doubles, the time period doubles as well. But the time period in parallel springs is time period over under root 2. This means that as springs double in parallel, the time period halves. Moving on to medical physics. The most important formula in medical physics is the final intensity equals the initial intensity I naught into e raised to power negative ux, where this u is the linear absorption coefficient and x is the thickness. Moving on, specific acoustic impedance z equals to the density of the medium into the speed of light. Intensity reflection coefficient is z2 minus z1 over z2 plus z1 whole square, where z2 and z1 are two different medium of specific acoustic impedance. Intensity reflection coefficient is also the reflected intensity over the final intensity. Transmitted intensity fraction IT equals to 1 minus the intensity reflection coefficient. And finally, the intensity that is reflected plus the intensity that is transmitted equals to 1. Moving on to the last and final chapter, which is cosmology. The radiant flux intensity F equals to luminosity over the area, which is 4 pi d square of that planet. This luminosity is called power as well. F can also be said to be B, which is apparent brightness. Apparent brightness or radiant flux intensity F1 is inversely proportional to the distance of the planet squared. So I can say F1 d1 square equals to F2 d2 squared. Luminosity L equals to Stefan Boltzmann constant into the area of the planet into the temperature raised to power 4. Now Wayne's displacement law, which is temperature equals to 2.9 times 10 raised to power negative 3 over the maximum wavelength. We can use equation number 4 and 3 to find area of the planet and eventually find the radius of the planet as well. Hubble's law states that velocity or speed of recession equals to the Hubble's constant into the distance from the Earth. And finally, the last equation, which is known as the redshift ratio, is the difference between the wavelength over the initial wavelength is equals to the speed of recession over the speed of light. And we can use all of this equation to find the recessional velocity v.